in order to understand how we got to where we got in the 70s, we need to understand the mentality of policy ideas in the period. The roots are in the 1960s because of the desire that was there in policy circles and in academia to use the tools of macroeconomics that had been developed the previous couple of decades, to use economic policy to deliver a great society, eliminate the business cycle, fine-tune the economy to have maximum employment all the time, while respecting price stability. And the goals were noble. Managing all of these things would have been wonderful in theory. The difficulty is that in practice, you can never deliver all of those goals. Policymakers, in order to stabilize the economy, need to understand what normal is. And they were trying to stabilize the economy at the level of unemployment that was too optimistic, at the level of output that was too optimistic, effectively allowing a drift of inflation to develop over time. It's quite ironic that I do blame, and many others blame Arthur Burns specifically as the chair of the Fed at the time for the 1970s. It's quite ironic because Arthur Burns was the person who literally had written the book on business cycle. You will recall his great work with Wesley Mitchell on the business cycle, and in his writings in 1950s, 1960s. He showed that he was very well aware of the limits of stabilization policy, of the risks of monetary policy not focused on price stability, and yet under his chairmanship, we ended up with pretty bad outcomes. In my view, at the end of the day, Arthur Burns, much like most other policymakers, felt that it was the responsibility of the Federal Reserve to deliver maximum employment. That, after all, was in the law, and did not quite internalize correctly. And I think in retrospect, we can be clear about that. He did not internalize correctly how much damage one would do in the long term to the economy by losing track of price stability and letting inflation get out of control. I have to start by mentioning one thing that we didn't really put in that paper that is actually very important. And if you want to hear that story, you need to go and find Joe Coyne's recollections from 1979 that the Federal Reserve has published in its oral history. Just how crazy was that? It was shock therapy. It was shock therapy. Paul Volcker called the meeting on Saturday, and it was the same Saturday when the Pope was visiting Washington, D.C. We didn't put that in the paper, but it's actually consequential because since the Pope was visiting Washington, D.C., and the Pope had a meeting at the mall right outside the Fed. If you know, the Fed is on Constitution Avenue, right overlooking the mall. So this is consequential because the Joe Coyne, who was the chief of communication at the Fed at the time, had a very hard time finding reporters to come and report on the outcome of the meeting. And what Paul Volcker wanted to do was use shock therapy to explain to everybody that what they had observed earlier on, the miscommunication that had happened in September, was a mistake. It did not reflect the Fed's plan to restore price stability. And he wanted to highlight that things would drastically change in how the Federal Reserve operated to avoid repeating the operating procedures, I should say, avoid continuing with the operating procedures that had failed to restore price stability. So the change in operating procedure was effectively saying, look, we have been using the federal funds rate as a primary instrument for gradual adjustments in policy. And in doing those gradual adjustments in policy, we have demonstrated in the late 70s that we have not managed to calibrate the level of the federal funds rate to be sufficiently restrictive to reduce inflation and put the country on a path to price stability. She had to change operating procedures because the reliance on the federal funds rate had failed. Why had it failed? Because the inflation process and the inflation expectations process were no longer anchored, and the Federal Reserve could not tell if it was raising the real interest rate, which is what it needed to do in order to disinflate. By changing the operating procedures, Paul Volcker effectively adopted a framework that, it had some disadvantages. We can discuss those later on, but it had the advantage that it focused the message of policy on a reduction in the money supply, which, like it or not, is going to tighten monetary conditions and eventually deliver price stability, even without knowing what the appropriate level of the federal funds rate would be needed to correspond that. So it was shock therapy to get us back to a path to price stability, even though at the time they didn't know whether it would work very well. They didn't know whether it would be credible. They didn't know whether they would stick with it over several months. But it was very, very important to have the shock therapy and have the message in order to have a chance to change expectations and reestablish the Fed's credibility. I have a letter Paul Volcker wrote here in 2004 when Bob Rush and I were co-organizing the conference at the St. Louis Fed on the 25th anniversary, and he highlighted the reason that he adopted the monetary targeting procedures. And let me quote this. He says, "The change to stricter monetary policy targeting seemed to me to be at one and the same, to build on the public perception that, quote, too much money equals inflation, end quote, and to discipline ourselves how to retreat without embarrassment." So he did find those additional elements helpful in adopting the monetary procedures at the time. And another one, I will give you this one more sentence from this quote. He says, "And I can't remember how many times I struck out the word gradually from staff drafts." I will first start with a couple of sentences from another letter that Paul Volcker wrote to Bill Poole. We failed to get him to come to our conference, and we failed to have him contribute something to the volume back in 2004. But we were successful in having him write 2 letters, and in one of them, he gave what I believe is one of the most important lessons from that experience. And he says in that letter, this is the letter written on May 26, 2004, by Paul Volcker to Bill Poole, then president of the St. Louis Fed, and he says, "I have one lesson indelible in my brain: don't let inflation get ingrained. Once that happens, there's too much agony in stopping the momentum." That's the key lesson. And I want to stress this is a lesson that, in my experience observing the Federal Reserve, both during the time I was there and since then, and I've been out of the Fed for 15 years now, if I have my timing right, is that this is a lesson that I believe the Federal Reserve has espoused, and I hope that it will be committed to going forward. What do I mean by that? Consider the change in monetary policy strategy in 2012. For the first time in its history, in 2012, the Federal Reserve says, yes, we have a clear definition of price stability. 2%. You may discuss, should it be 1, 2, 3? It doesn't matter. What's important is saying we have a clear definition of price stability, and our policy will be formulated so that in the long term, we deliver on that objective. We will deliver price stability. We are in charge of price stability, and we will deliver on price stability. This is one thing. The second thing, which again relates to the quote I just read you from Paul Volcker, is pay extreme attention to maintain inflation expectations well anchored in line with the definition of price stability. If your definition of price stability is 2% inflation over time, then you want medium to long-term inflation expectations by financial markets, by households, to be focused at 2% inflation. And I see that element being highlighted both in the 2012 policy strategy statement that the Federal Reserve put out, and also this is the one element that actually support the revision of the policy strategy that was implemented in 2020. The FOMC decided to double down on how important it is to keep inflation expectations well anchored. Now, in my view, that's an important lesson, because that means that it gives the Federal Reserve guidance about how aggressive policy needs to be on the circumstances where events are not coming the way you expected them to. Mistakes happen. Policy has to be forward-looking at some point. Forecast mistakes are quite common. And what we observe from time to time, like we have been observing over the past couple of years, is pretty big forecast errors. Now, as it happens, the forecast errors that we have observed over the past year, for example, have ended up delivering inflation much higher than was anticipated, and have actually started to disanchor inflation expectations. If you are to take the fundamental lessons from Paul Volcker's experience, which I think the Fed has pretty much taken on board since then, we need a forceful response to the threat of disanchoring inflation expectations. And if that means not being as gradualist as some policymakers would want us to be, and predictable as some policymakers would want us to be, so be it. Let me again remind you Paul Volcker's recollection from 1979. I will read this sentence again. I can't remember how many times I struck out the word gradually from staffed drafts. You need to maintain inflation expectations. You need to make sure inflation does not get out of control. And if you need shock therapy to do this, so be it. Go for it.